I wanted to make a video about the PID fundamentals. You know, there's a lot of videos that have been made on this in our hobby, but many of these have been made several years ago, for example. And, newcomers to the hobby often just don't come across these videos. A lot of this stuff is still really unknown to many people in the hobby. And what I really wanted to do was actually show you where the P, I, and D term come from. So I've just pulled up a log file here in Black Box Explorer, but I'm going to show you this in MATLAB because I want to actually compute the P and the D term by hand, because I want to show you how simple this is and how the P and the D are computed directly from the set point and the gyro signals. So let's go over to MATLAB. So this is the main MATLAB window where I do all the programming of PID Toolbox. Okay, so MATLAB is basically an academic tool. It's used a lot in science and engineering, and for good reason. It just has so much functionality for doing really advanced data analysis. So in essence, it is a programming language in and of itself. And the language is a very high-level language, so you don't have to compile or anything. And that's what makes it very useful for academics, so you don't have to be fooling around with compiling. So I've just opened up a log file in PID Toolbox. From the opening window, it always shows, of course, set point in red, and the gyro is plotted in black. So let's zoom in on this bigger movement for now. So you can see here that the set point is red, gyro is black, and the P term is green and the D term is blue. Actually, and I'll plot in here the I term as well. So have you ever wondered, like, how exactly is the P, I, and D terms calculated? I'm going to show you that in a separate window. So what I've done here is I've created just a little script that's going to pull out a little bit of that data, this data here, from this single move, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot first the gyro and then the set point. So all I do is run this script, and I'm plotting them this time in terms of in points. Whenever you see these plots, they're always plotted as lines. What we sometimes forget is that these are actually a bunch of discrete points, right? I'm just going to dock this so that you can see it. But if you zoom in on any part of this, you can see that it's a bunch of discrete points, right? Now what I'm going to do is just going to hold on. This just allows me to overlay multiple things. And then I'm going to plot here the set point. Okay, so now you can see the set point plotted here in red. Now, what is P term? Let's start there. What is P term? Well, in order to understand P term, you'd first need to understand what PID error is. So PID error is the difference between each of these sample points at any point in time. So basically all it is you take any one of these points at any given point in time, and then you subtract from it this value from the gyro. So the difference between set point and gyro at any one of these sample points. And you just keep doing that as you move along each sample point one after another. And then that creates another curve, a separate curve. And that curve is going to be basically representing the difference between these two curves. And that's called PID error, PID error. Well, it turns out that P term is essentially PID error. The only difference is that it's PID error that's multiplied by a gain factor. And that gain factor is essentially your PID settings in Betaflight or in whatever firmware you're running. There is another scaling factor as well. But main point is that it's just some scaling of that PID error by your P gain in Betaflight. So what I've done here then, all I'm doing here is I'm taking the set point for those set of sample points that represent this time in the log file. That's what these numbers represent. And I'm subtracting from it the gyro or roll at that same time. So we're basically creating the P term from this. And so I'm just going to run that. And now you can see the green line here represents that, okay? So again, it's the difference between each of these points at any point in time. So the difference between this and this multiplied by some scaling factor. This is why we say P term is proportional to the error. because it's basically some proportion of this error, right? If we multiplied it by 1, for example, then it would be exactly the PID error. If we multiplied it by a number higher than 1, then it'll be scaled higher than the PID error, right? But what we're doing then is we're using this difference as the pusher, right? And in essence, then, you know, the idea is that if you multiply this error by greater and greater numbers, then it's going to keep pushing. It's going to make this p-term signal higher and higher, and as a result, that's going to help push the gyro closer in time to the set point. It's going to shrink that error. You see, so this is where the feedback loop comes in. The actual measurement itself is used as the thing that actually pushes the copter into the movement. And by increasing the P gains, say, in here, what we're effectively doing is we're increasing the magnitude of this green signal, the P term. And the greater we make that, the more it's going to push the red and the black together. It's going to make the gyro move faster and respond quicker, and it's going to reduce that error. And as a result of reducing the error, then this is going to be smaller, and of course then we get closer and closer to what we're looking for. Okay? Now, what about D term? How is D term computed? Well, there are actually two ways that D term has technically been computed in different firmwares. In Betaflight, as of, since at least 4.0, maybe even before, D term has always been computed just directly from the gyro. But you can also compute D term from the difference between the red and the black, just like you did P term. But what's the difference with D term? Well, D term is the derivative. And if you know anything about derivatives, a derivative just means it's essentially slope. So the first derivative of the gyro, for example, is the instantaneous velocity of that signal. If we zoom in on any point, what D term is essentially the slope, or what we say the instantaneous velocity of one point to the next. Slope and velocity are essentially the same thing. All that means is the D term is essentially the rise over run of each sample. Okay, so first let's plot that. So that basically we can plot that with a little function called diff in MATLAB, and diff just takes the difference of each point from its subsequent point. Okay, and then we're going to smooth that a little bit because, of course, D term is really noisy, and we're going to take the negative sign of it. Okay, because D is always pushing in the opposite direction, so we just put a negative number in front of that, and we're going to multiply it by some gain. Again, that gets us close to where we want to be. So I'm going to replot again P term, and I'm going to just replot again P term, and now I'm going to plot D term on top of that. Okay, you see D going in this direction. Again, what are we looking at here? Basically, again, every point here in D term is essentially the difference between each point in the gyro and its next point, right? Okay, so that's the first derivative. So it essentially tells you the slope of this signal. So you can see that the slope of the signal gets highest at about this point in the curve. But again, you can see that these are all just basically points. This was P and D, where it was basically I just computed it directly from the set point and gyro signals. Now, there's also a thing called D from error. I don't want to get too much into it, but basically D from error is like P term was computed from the difference between the set point and the gyro, the red and the black, right? Well, D term can also be computed as the derivative of that error as well. Instead of being the derivative of the gyro signal itself, it's instead the derivative of the error, the difference between the red and the black. And that would be what we call D from error. And in fact, I think KISS and even EMU Flight still have options to compute D from error, and older Betaflight versions used to compute D from error. But since implementing feed forward into Betaflight, D has been only computed from the gyro, and that's what you've probably sometimes heard as D from measurement. Now, what about I term? Well, I term is like P term is based on the difference between the set point and gyro, but instead of just looking at multiplying that difference by some proportion, it actually accumulates the differences. So it keeps adding them together, right? So you take the difference between this and this, and you add it with the previous difference, and then the difference between the next sample is added to the previous, and so on. So it's essentially the area under the curve. And so then you can see that if you keep summing, you're basically accumulating. The numbers are going to continually increase and increase and increase. And this is why I term can wind up, as we say, So if the difference between the set point and gyro is very large, I term can really get quite high. And so there are special features in Betaflight and in the other firmwares that help control that not to be the case. But for the sake of simplicity, I can just basically do it here in code with what's called a cumulative sum. And so I'll just plot that in another color here. Okay, so this is kind of our I term, but I term is quite complicated in some ways, the way it's computed in Betaflight. So for now, I'll just leave that out of the discussion here. So what I wanted to talk about now is why a decent set point matters. Why does set point matter? So, because you hear a lot of talk these days about making sure that your radio and your RX signal are nice and smooth, but why does that matter? Well, in the past, it didn't matter very much for people that were flying wings, for example, because they didn't have the response characteristics that would make it matter. Well, they were also not using PID controllers. What I mean by that is when you're computing the P term, the shape and the quality of the input, the set point, matters, right? If this was, for example, a bunch of steps, then you can imagine that as you compute the difference with the gyro, you'd get kind of pulses in the P term. In fact, you can see hints of it right here still. And if you look at the set point, you can see sort of a little blip here and in a second and a second. Those are basically the remnants of the square wave input that characterizes the receiver signal. I'm running Crossfire 50 Hertz here. So these little pulses here, for example, very subtle, but those pulses are coming in at approximately 20 milliseconds apart. That's 50 Hertz. That's 50 Hertz Crossfire, right? And if the quality of this is not smoothed out, these pulses get much larger. And if they're large enough, remember the P term is what's pushing you into the move. So if these are large enough, it's going to be it's going to actually start to cause those same ripples to show up on the gyro. Okay? If P term was affecting the gyro and creating those blips there, then you would also see them on D term as well. Let me give you a better example. So this is an example of a log file with a less than adequate RC signal. What I want you to see is this. What you can see here is because the RC signal is kind of coming in like this, pulsed, right? You can occasionally actually see it show up on the gyro itself. So for example, you see how the set point here is kind of blipping like that, and here and here. And then you can see it actually starting to affect the gyro signal itself, see? And so that's because, again, if we were to plot the P term, you can see that the P term itself is also pulsing on these, right? Because the difference, again, P term is, again, the difference between these multiplied by some gain factor, right? And so where you see, especially this pulse here, you can see that show up as this big change right here, right? And that is causing these bumps in the gyro as well, because P is now pushing it like this, right? And as a result of that, you also get it in D term. You see that? Pulse right there, okay? So yeah, it's really important that you have a very decent quality RC signal for these reasons. And you can imagine then, especially as you move towards using feed forward, Feed forward is going to use the actual set point signal itself, or the RC signal, and it's going to use this to push the copter. And so, you know, any kind of bad RC signal is also going to be amplified again with feed forward. Yeah, so I hope that provided some insight into how these our P, I, and D terms are computed from the set point and gyro, and how important it is to have a pretty decent RC signal for our rigs. I hope that helped.